What if I told you that the most dangerous economic condition is not scarcity, not inflation, not even debt, but cheapness, the kind of cheapness so extreme that it destroys profit, purpose, and eventually the system that created it? Because when everything becomes cheap enough to win, no one wins, and for decades China looked like the ultimate winner, the factory of the world. A civilization that turned scale into a weapon and efficiency into ideology, cities glowing through the night, ports that never slept, assembly lines moving with military precision, prices falling year after year until competitors across the West simply gave up, a miracle so complete it reshaped how humanity consumes, works, and lives. But every miracle has a hidden bill, and China's greatest strength, its unmatched ability to make everything cheaper, faster, and bigger, has quietly become the force pulling it inward, bending the system until it begins to collapse under its own weight. And to understand how an economy can optimize itself into exhaustion, how efficiency can mutate into self-destruction, we have to go back to the moment the rules were broken, because China's story is not just about factories and exports, it's about incentives, legitimacy, and a growth machine that learned how to run but never how to stop. In 1978, China stood at the edge of irrelevance, poor, inward-looking, scarred by ideology and famine. And then Deng Xiaoping did something revolutionary, not by changing the system, but by bending it, standing before the Communist Party and committing heresy. He said getting rich was not shameful, it was patriotic, a single sentence that detonated inside a socialist state. Because it quietly replaced ideology with output, loyalty with productivity, belief with results, and almost overnight the countryside changed, peasants became entrepreneurs, collectives became workshops, rice paddies became factory floors, and China didn't liberalize all at once, it experimented, opening small zones where capitalism was allowed to breathe, special economic zones where the rules were different, where profit wasn't punished and foreigners were welcomed, and to Japan, to America, to Europe, these zones looked like a dream. Endless labor, disciplined workers, a government that built roads faster than paperwork, and wages so low they felt unreal. Shenzhen was the prototype, a fishing village of 30,000 people transformed into a city of millions in less than a generation, not by innovation, but by imitation, not by brands, but by volume. And when Beijing saw that it worked, it didn't slow down, it replicated the model everywhere, province after province racing to build the next Shenzhen, because in China's system, growth wasn't just success. It was survival. Local officials were promoted not for stability, not for sustainability, but for numbers, GDP growth, export figures, industrial output, and so local governments borrowed, built, and begged for factories, highways appeared overnight, power plants rose in fields, industrial parks sprawled across farmland, and by the early 2000s China wasn't just participating in global trade, it was consuming it, devouring the world's demand for steel, coal, copper, oil, plastics, textiles, electronics, anything that could be stamped, molded, or assembled eventually became made in China. The West didn't resist, it surrendered willingly, because China solved the problem capitalism had always struggled with: how to make things cheaper without collapsing the system. Or so it seemed. Companies offshored production, shareholders cheered, consumers got abundance without inflation, the $5 t-shirt, the $300 smartphone, entire lifestyles subsidized by invisible labor across the ocean. And China got rich, or at least it appeared to, because beneath the unstoppable rise was a dangerous incentive structure forming quietly, almost invisibly. Success meant being cheaper than everyone else, and in a system where millions of firms compete under political pressure to grow, cheapness becomes an addiction. Local governments competed for factories by cutting land prices, cutting taxes, cutting regulations, firms competed by cutting margins, cutting wages, cutting corners, and everyone chased volume because volume was the only metric that mattered. Nobody asked whether the profits were real, whether the debt could be repaid, whether the demand would last, because the machine was too powerful. Workers poured in from the countryside by the millions, young, desperate, willing to work 12-hour shifts for wages that Western unions would riot over. The factories ran day and night, ports expanded endlessly, and for a while, it didn't matter that profits were thin, because growth covered everything. Growth paid the interest, growth justified the loans, growth maintained legitimacy. But systems built on volume rather than value always faced the same enemy, saturation, and somewhere between the 10th new shopping mall and the 100th steel mill, the Chinese miracle began to overheat, not collapse, not slow, but distort, because the machine didn't know how to downshift. Local governments had borrowed too much to stop, factories had invested too heavily to pause, and so when demand stopped rising fast enough, the response wasn't restraint, it was acceleration, produce more. To make less feel like more, and by the mid-2010s China had built more industrial capacity than the world could possibly absorb. Steel is the clearest example. By 2015 China's steel capacity exceeded the rest of the world combined, entire industrial zones pumping out metal regardless of price, regardless of profit, because shutting down a plant meant layoffs, and layoffs meant social instability, and instability was the only true taboo. Prices fell not because of innovation, but because of desperation. Factories didn't close when margins disappeared, they ramped up output hoping scale could save them, and that's when a word long used to describe exhausted students and overworked professionals entered the economic vocabulary: involution. Involution isn't competition that drives progress, it's competition that consumes itself, a system where effort increases but rewards shrink, where everyone works harder just to stay in place, and what began as a cultural observation became an industrial reality. Whole sectors locked into zero-sum price wars where the only remaining weapon was price: solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles. Symbols of China's technological future became battlegrounds of mutual destruction. Dozens of firms producing near-identical products, many state-backed, all slashing prices to undercut the next, margins evaporating, balance sheets bleeding, but no one daring to stop, because in China's political economy, output equals legitimacy, and losing production means losing face, losing funding, losing protection. So the cycle fed itself, prices fell, competitors matched them, profits collapsed, wages stagnated, consumers cheered at first, until cheap abundance revealed its cost. Because cheap goods don't create prosperity, they redistribute it downward until there's nothing left to redistribute, and by the early 2020s China had entered an era of industrial involution. A self-destructive loop where efficiency devoured profit and production devoured purpose. And the data told a brutal story: factories moving more goods than ever, earning less from every unit, exports breaking records while industrial profits fell, growth continuing on paper while value evaporated in reality. This wasn't capitalism in overdrive, it was capitalism eating itself, and the irony was that China had seen this movie before, in coal, in steel, in shipbuilding, where overproduction pushed prices so low the government had to intervene brutally, closing mines, merging plants, firing hundreds of thousands of workers to save the system. Economic triage performed in the name of survival. And now the same disease was spreading. Only this time it wasn't a single industry, it was the entire growth model. Factories don't close because spreadsheets demand it, they close when politics allows it, and Chinese politics doesn't reward contraction, it rewards motion, even if that motion is circular. Officials know the numbers behind closed doors: falling profits, rising debt, stalled wages. But publicly the message remains unchanged: keep producing, keep growing, keep believing, because if the machine stops, the illusion does too. And by the 2020s China's efficiency engine had become something else entirely, an economy locked in an arms race against itself. From the outside it still looked like triumph: record exports, gleaming new plants, EVs and solar panels rolling off lines in numbers that could power continents. But inside, profit margins were collapsing, the miracle had stopped creating wealth, it was now just recycling it thinner and faster every year, and economists called it overcapacity. But in China overcapacity isn't a bug, it's policy. Because production is proof of control. Take solar panels. In a single year China produced more than double global demand, prices collapsed nearly 40%, firms sold below cost just to clear inventory, smaller players went bankrupt while giants kept producing because local governments needed the jobs, the numbers, the illusion of progress, and electric vehicles followed the same path, over 100 brands fighting for a shrinking domestic market. Each price cut forcing another, subsidies stepping in not to fix the problem but to delay the reckoning, because subsidies don't reduce supply, they multiply it. By 2024, industrial profits had fallen sharply even as exports surged, a contradiction that exposed the core flaw. The economy could move mountains of goods but couldn't extract value from them. And here's the uncomfortable truth: not all of this is accidental, some of it is deliberate, because China has mastered weaponized efficiency. Using state support to keep industries alive long enough to crush competitors, selling below cost not to survive, but to dominate, flooding markets until rivals, bound by profit expectations, collapse, and once supply chains depend on Chinese production, leverage shifts, terms change, prices rise, monopoly emerges. This playbook worked before, with steel, with rare earths, with shipbuilding, but this time the stakes are higher, because these aren't commodities of the past, they're the infrastructure of the future: batteries, photovoltaics, electric drivetrains, the arteries of the 21st century economy. And in theory it's brilliant, but in practice it's fragile. Because there's a limit to how long a system can lose money strategically before the rot spreads, when every sector expects bailouts. Efficiency becomes addiction, competition becomes political, and productivity turns into entitlement. And this is where the trap closes, because domination built on loss isn't victory, it's deferred collapse, an economy that can't afford to slow down because every layer depends on motion. Local governments need factories running to service debt, banks need borrowers to justify balance sheets, the central government needs employment to maintain legitimacy. And so everyone pretends that more output equals more prosperity. Even when it doesn't, and this isn't irrational, it's survival, because China's economy isn't just an engine of wealth, it's an engine of belief. Its social contract was simple: keep growing and life will keep improving, but growth that only creates cheaper goods can't raise living standards forever. And the paradox is brutal: China's overproduction keeps global inflation low while suppressing its own wages and demand, exporting deflation to the world while importing stagnation at home. And the West once welcomed cheap Chinese goods as a gift, but abundance has a cost. Factories close elsewhere, emerging markets can't industrialize, and the global price of cheap becomes fragility. History has seen this before: empires mastering efficiency only to drown in it, Britain flooding coal markets until miners starved, Japan hitting overcapacity and deflation in the 1990s, Rome pumping out grain with slave labor until prices collapsed and small farmers vanished. Efficiency without balance always ends the same way, and China now stands at that familiar edge, knowing it must rebalance toward consumption and innovation, but trapped by incentives that reward more of the same. Provinces still building, factories still expanding, output still rising because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. And this is where part 1 ends, not with collapse, but with momentum, an economy running at full speed toward a wall it can see but cannot slow for, because when growth becomes identity and production replaces purpose, efficiency stops being a strength and becomes a disease. And the question isn't whether China can keep producing, it's whether it can afford to stop, because there's nothing more expensive than being too cheap. And that is where the real danger begins, because an economy can survive bad years, bad policies, even bad leaders, but it cannot survive an identity it can no longer fulfill, and China's identity for 4 decades has been growth itself, not prosperity, not innovation, not balance, but motion, relentless forward motion, measured in output, exports, and concrete poured, and once motion becomes identity, slowing down feels like collapse, even when slowing down is the only way to survive. The moment China's factories began producing more than the world could absorb, the problem stopped being domestic and became global. Because excess production never stays contained, it spills outward, flooding international markets with deflation. And what looks like cheap abundance to consumers looks like extinction to producers. And suddenly the same efficiency that once made China indispensable began making it dangerous in the eyes of its trading partners. By the early 2020s, Western governments had learned the lesson their industries learned years earlier: you cannot outcompete a system that does not require profit to survive. And so tariffs returned, not as ideology but as defense. Anti-dumping investigations multiplied, electric vehicles, solar panels, steel, aluminum, all became battlegrounds, not because the West suddenly hated trade, but because trade had stopped being reciprocal, when one side sells below cost indefinitely and the other cannot. Markets stop being markets and become sieges. China responded the only way it knew how: more support, more subsidies, more credit, because retreat would mean admitting that the growth machine had reached its limits, and limits are politically radioactive. But every yuan used to keep prices artificially low carried a hidden cost, because subsidies don't disappear, they accumulate, transforming industrial policy into fiscal gravity. This is where debt enters the story, not as a sudden crisis, but as a slow binding force, because China didn't finance its miracle through consumer borrowing, it financed it through investment, local governments borrowing to build, state banks lending to factories, shadow financing filling the gaps, and for years it worked because growth outran debt. But when profits collapsed and demand slowed, the math flipped, and debt stopped being fuel and became ballast. Local governments are the weakest link, caught between Beijing's growth targets and economic reality, because they own the land, they build the infrastructure, they guarantee the loans, and when factories fail to generate returns, the losses don't vanish, they migrate upward, hidden in financing vehicles, rolled over, extended, disguised, but never erased, and the longer the system avoids recognition, the heavier it becomes. Real estate made this worse, not because it was separate from industry, but because it absorbed the same logic: build more, sell faster, grow endlessly, until apartments outnumbered families and cities rose without residents, and when property prices stalled, the illusion cracked, because real estate wasn't just housing, it was collateral, savings, local government revenue, and social confidence rolled into one. And when confidence fades, consumption doesn't rise, it freezes. This is the second trap inside the first: an economy that overproduces goods while underproducing demand, because households don't spend when wages stagnate, and wages don't rise when profits vanish, and profits don't recover when prices are trapped in endless competition, so the system turns back to exports, not as choice, but as necessity, pushing its excess outward again, intensifying global tension. But even exports have limits, because the world is no longer willing to absorb infinite cheapness, not when it destroys domestic industries, not when it creates strategic dependence, and so barriers rise, slowly at first, then suddenly, and China finds itself facing a world that needs its products but fears its dominance. At the same time, a quieter, more irreversible force tightens the vice: demographics, because China's miracle was powered by surplus labor, millions of young workers moving from countryside to city, fueling factories and keeping wages low, but that surplus is gone, the population is aging, shrinking, and fewer workers must support more retirees. And an economy built on endless expansion struggles when its labor force contracts. This is where the cheapness paradox turns cruel, because low prices suppress wages, suppressed wages suppress consumption, and weak consumption makes overproduction worse, a feedback loop that no amount of efficiency can escape, and attempts to stimulate demand through credit only deepen the debt overhang, while attempts to raise wages threaten competitiveness, and so policy oscillates, never fully committing to either path. Beijing knows the solution in theory: shift from investment to consumption, from quantity to quality, from imitation to innovation, but theory collides with incentives, because innovation is risky, consumption is slow, and stability demands immediate output, and so provinces keep building, firms keep producing, and the center keeps managing symptoms instead of curing disease. This is why technological self-sufficiency became a political mantra, not just to escape foreign pressure, but to justify continued industrial expansion: semiconductors, AI, advanced manufacturing, each framed as the next growth engine. But even high-tech sectors are not immune to involution when dozens of players chase the same subsidies, the same markets, the same prestige, and without demand. Even the most advanced factory becomes another source of excess. And here the historical parallels sharpen, because Japan in the 1990s faced the same trinity: overcapacity, deflation, aging demographics, and debt, and it chose stability over disruption, preserving firms, rolling over loans, accepting stagnation in exchange for social calm, and Japan survived, but it never truly escaped, decades of lost growth became the price of avoiding collapse. China's scale makes that choice far more dangerous, because stagnation at this size is not quiet, it reverberates through supply chains, commodity markets, geopolitics, and global growth, and the question becomes not whether China collapses, but what kind of slowdown it chooses, a managed deceleration, a Japanese-style freeze, or a more volatile adjustment forced by crisis. The political dimension makes this harder, because unlike market economies where failure clears space for renewal, China's system resists failure, not out of denial, but out of fear that unemployment becomes unrest, that unrest becomes instability, and instability threatens legitimacy, and so inefficiency is tolerated if it preserves order, even when it corrodes the future. This is why factory closures are slow, mergers are guided, bankruptcies are managed, and losses are socialized, because sudden shocks are more dangerous than slow decay. But decay has a cost too, it erodes trust, ambition, and risk-taking, the very ingredients innovation requires. And yet, the world still underestimates China's capacity to adapt, because the same state that built this machine can also dismantle parts of it, if it chooses to pay the price. Capacity cuts, debt recognition, income redistribution, stronger social safety nets to encourage spending, these are not impossible, they are politically expensive, and the central question is timing. Whether reform arrives before inertia hardens into stagnation. The tragedy of the China trap is not that the country failed, but that it succeeded too well at a single dimension of progress: efficiency without balance, production without demand, growth without resilience. And history shows that empires rarely fall because they lack power, they fall because they cannot change the habits that power created. Britain ruled coal and industry until cheapness hollowed its own base. Japan conquered manufacturing until deflation froze its economy. Rome mastered agriculture until abundance destroyed its farmers. And China now confronts the same ancient dilemma. Can an empire built on optimization learn restraint before optimization consumes it? This is why the end of China's story is not written in collapse headlines, but in margins, wages, demographics, and confidence, slow-moving forces that rarely make news until it's too late, and the greatest risk is not a sudden crash, but a long plateau where motion continues but meaning disappears. Because an economy can produce endlessly and still feel poor, it can export triumph and import doubt, it can dominate markets while losing momentum. And that is the final irony of cheapness. It looks like strength until it becomes a cage. China may yet escape the trap, but only by accepting something its system has long resisted, that sometimes the most powerful move is not to produce more, but to produce less, to let prices rise, firms fail, wages grow, and consumption breathe, and that choice requires a confidence that growth alone once provided. Until then, the machine keeps running. Factories keep humming, goods keep flowing, prices keep falling, and the world watches an economy that mastered efficiency confront its own reflection, discovering that when everything becomes cheap enough to win, the victory costs more than anyone imagined. And that is why the China trap matters to all of us, because this is not just China's story, it is a warning written in scale, a lesson in what happens when capitalism is pushed to its logical extreme, when optimization outruns purpose, and when growth becomes a substitute for meaning. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and right now, the rhyme is clear: there is nothing more expensive than being too cheap. If this changed how you see the global economy, subscribe, because the past doesn't just explain the present, it predicts the future, if you know where to look.